A weathered slab of limestone pulled out of the jungle floor in southern Mexico just pushed back the origin of Maya political power by more than a century, and it did it using a single carved date that nobody had been able to read clearly until researchers pointed a 3D scanner at it in 2026. That single date is now reshaping how historians understand the earliest years of Maya royal power, and it arrived alongside two other major Mexican discoveries announced within weeks of each other this same year, each one independently peer-reviewed, each one backed by named archaeologists and government research institutions, and each one adding a genuinely new, physically verifiable layer to what was previously known about pre-Hispanic Mexico. The stone is called Stela 46, and it comes from El Palmar, a Maya city in the southeastern part of Campeche state, buried under thick jungle canopy in a region that also holds some of the most important Maya sites ever documented, including Calakmul, Bacan, and El Mirador. El Palmar itself was first recorded back in 1936 by archaeologist Eric Thompson, but most of the site has remained hidden under vegetation ever since, studied only in fragments across nearly 2 decades of ongoing fieldwork by what's now called the El Palmar Archaeological Project, led by Kenichiro Tsukamoto of the University of California, Riverside, and Javier Lopez Camacho of Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, known by its Spanish acronym INH. The site itself is substantial, including a main group of temples and plazas at its core, along with several outlying architectural complexes, artificial water reservoirs, and numerous carved stone monuments scattered across the settlement, many of which had already been documented in earlier research phases but were, until recently, believed to belong almost entirely to the later late Classic period. That assumption is part of what makes Stela 46 so significant. It didn't just add a new monument to the record, it forced researchers to reconsider how far back El Palmar's political history actually extended, revealing an earlier phase of organized dynastic rule that previous surveys of the site had simply never detected. For most of that time, Stela 46 sat as a badly eroded block of stone, nearly 3 meters long, with inscriptions too weathered to fully decipher using traditional methods. That changed when the research team applied high-resolution 3D scanning and photogrammetry, techniques that let researchers capture microscopic variations in surface depth across a carved stone and then digitally enhance the contrast between worn glyphs and the surrounding rock. Under that kind of digital reconstruction, epigraphist Octavio Esparza Holguin of Mexico's National Autonomous University was able to identify a long count calendar date carved into the stone recorded as 8-7-1-0-0, corresponding to August 31st in the year 180 CE on the modern calendar. Photogrammetry works by taking hundreds, sometimes thousands, of overlapping photographs of a single object from slightly different angles, then using software to stitch those images together into a precise, measurable 3-dimensional digital model. Combined with high-resolution laser scanning, which measures surface depth down to fractions of a millimeter, researchers can then digitally manipulate lighting and shadow across the reconstructed surface in ways completely impossible with a flashlight and a camera in the field. Faint grooves left by an ancient carver's chisel, worn nearly flat by 18 centuries of tropical rain and jungle humidity, can suddenly become readable once researchers can angle a virtual light source across the model from dozens of different directions and compare the results side by side. That date matters enormously to anyone who studies Maya civilization because it now stands as the earliest confirmed long count date ever found anywhere in the Maya. Lowlands, predating the previous record holder, Astila, found it Tikal by more than 112 years. The long count wasn't just a calendar in the way we think of calendars today. It was a continuous, linear dating system that Maya rulers used specifically to record and publicly display their own personal milestones, births, marriages, military victories, and especially their accession to power, carved permanently into stone where their subjects could see it. Using the long count was a political act, as much as a chronological one. It let a ruler place themselves inside an unbroken, cosmically significant timeline, reinforcing the idea that their authority was part of a larger, almost sacred order, rather than something they simply seized through force. The long count itself worked as a non-repeating counting system, built on a combination of base 20 and base 18 units that tracked the number of days elapsed since a fixed mythological starting point far in the Maya past. Unlike shorter cyclical calendars used across Mesoamerica, which reset after fixed periods and were primarily tied to agricultural and ritual cycles, the long count moved in one direction only, forward, which made it uniquely useful for recording specific historical events in a fixed, unambiguous sequence rather than a repeating pattern. That distinction is part of why modern researchers can use surviving long count inscriptions almost like a precise historical ledger, converting ancient carved dates directly into exact days on the modern calendar with a level of confidence rarely available for other ancient civilizations without written numerical dating systems of their own. Researchers had long understood that the long count became central to Maya political life during what's called the Classic period, which begins around 250 CE and is defined by the rise of powerful city-states, elaborate royal inscriptions, palace complexes, and large stepped pyramids. What remained far murkier was how this system of using time itself as a tool of political legitimacy actually got started in the first place. Stela 46 answers part of that question directly, showing that rulers at El Palmar were already using the long count to assert dynastic authority a full 70 years before the Classic period is traditionally considered to have begun. The researchers didn't stop at a single stone. They also studied two additional monuments at the site, Stela 45 and Stela 20, both of which had similarly suffered heavy erosion over the centuries. Stela 45, now on display at the Museum of Maya Architecture, carries its own long count date of 8, 15, 5, 8, 11, corresponding to the year 342 CE, and some of its surviving glyphs may reference a ruler whose name researchers tentatively read as Chu-Chak-Ak, though the team is careful to note that reading remains inconclusive given how much of the inscription has been lost to weathering. Taken together, the three monuments suggest that El Palmar's early ruling dynasty had access to real political authority and genuine economic resources, reflected not only in the stelae themselves, but in the major architectural construction happening across the site during the same period. Adriana Velázquez Morley, director of INA's Campeche Center, was part of the broader research team alongside iconographer Daniel Salazar of the French archaeological organization Archaeos and independent archaeologist Luis Evelia Campagna, whose combined analysis was published in 2026 in the peer-reviewed journal Ancient Mesoamerica under the title The Emergence of Kingship and Early Long Counts in the Maya Kingdom of El Palmar, Campeche, Mexico. That publication represents the kind of rigorous, citable, peer-reviewed process that separates a genuine historical revision from a viral internet claim. This isn't a rumor circulating on social media. It's a dated academic paper tied to named researchers, working institutions, and a physical artifact now conserved and on public display for anyone who wants to go verify it in person. This kind of discovery doesn't happen in isolation either. Just weeks before the El Palmar findings were published, a completely separate INH team working roughly 600 kilometers away in the state of Veracruz uncovered something that added an entirely different layer to the picture of pre-Hispanic Mexico. During a legally mandated archaeological salvage project ahead of a residential development near the town of Cotepec, researchers led by Alberto Vázquez Dominguez and Lino Espinoza Garcia of INA's Veracruz Center uncovered the remains of a ceremonial complex dating to the early Classic period, somewhere between 200 and 600 CE, roughly overlapping with the same era as the earliest inscriptions at El Palmar. The centerpiece of the Veracruz find is a rectangular stone platform measuring 30 meters long and 12 meters wide. Built from carefully worked white limestone and featuring engraved geometric patterns along with circular stones embedded into two of its sides, architectural details that INA researchers say have never been documented anywhere else in that region. Standing beside the platform, excavators found a carved stone monument nearly 2 meters tall, depicting two elaborately dressed elite figures receiving what appears to be a sacred fluid from a divine figure positioned above them. One of the two human figures in the carving displays what researchers describe as possible Maya stylistic characteristics, despite the site sitting well outside territory typically associated with Maya civilization, hinting at cultural contact and exchange stretching across a wider swath of Mesoamerica than this specific site would normally suggest on its own. Lino Espinoza Garcia, one of the lead archaeologists on the project, described the platform as a genuinely unique and unprecedented find, noting that the team currently has no clear correlation between its architectural style and any other previously documented site in the region. Mexican archaeologists were careful to note that although the surrounding region is usually associated with the Totonac civilization, nothing found at this particular site directly links it to that culture. Instead, researchers currently believe the community responsible for building it developed its own distinct local traditions while still maintaining meaningful contact with other groups along the Gulf Coast. Buried offerings recovered from the site, including charred maize remains, intact pottery vessels, and a fragmented greenstone bead, are now undergoing laboratory analysis, with full results expected in early 2027. Mexico's Secretary of Culture, Claudia Curiel de Casa, described the find as a reminder that the country possesses one of the deepest and most diverse cultural heritages in the world, while President Claudia Sheinbaum personally called the discovery very relevant during a nationally broadcast press briefing. committing government resources toward its continued investigation and eventual restoration. The excavation itself is taking place on privately owned land, a 12-hectare parcel that had been under archaeological monitoring since late 2025 after its designated land use was changed to permit residential construction. Fieldwork at the Coatepec site is expected to continue through August 2026, with full laboratory analysis of the recovered artifacts projected to wrap up in early 2027. A third, and separate discovery, announced only weeks later, pushed the pattern even further north into central Mexico near the ancient Toltec capital of Tula, in the modern state of Hidalgo. INA researchers working near the archaeological zone uncovered a large structure measuring 40 by 80 meters, which they've labeled Structure 2, decorated with carved reliefs depicting chalchihuites, the green stone beads that carry deep symbolic meaning as markers of wealth and political power in Mesoamerican cultures. Alongside the structure, the team recovered ancient human burials and 2 carved stone slabs that appear to have originally come from Pyramid B, the famous Tula monument known worldwide for its towering stone warrior columns. Tula itself, known to archaeologists as Tollan Xicocoatitlan, served as the capital of the Toltec civilization roughly between 900 and 1150 CE, a culture that later Aztec rulers would go on to mythologize almost to the point of legend, treating Toltec heritage as a mark of legitimate, prestigious ancestry worth claiming for their own dynasties centuries after Tula itself had fallen. What makes the Tula discovery significant isn't simply the scale of the building itself, but its timing. The structure and its associated burials date to roughly 1,000 years ago, centuries after Tula's own political peak, suggesting later communities were deliberately building near the ruins of the old Toltec capital, in an apparent effort to visually and symbolically connect themselves to Tula's earlier power and prestige. Researchers involved in the Tula excavation say further analysis of the burials found alongside Structure 2 should help clarify exactly who these later builders were and how directly they understood themselves to be connected to Tula's original ruling lineage, work that is expected to continue over the coming excavation seasons. That kind of deliberate architectural continuity mirrors exactly the kind of political theater El Palmar's early rulers were engaged in when they first began carving long count dates into stone, using time, memory, and symbolism as tools of legitimate rule rather than relying purely on military force. Archaeologists studying Mesoamerican political culture have documented this pattern of borrowed legitimacy at numerous sites, where later rulers deliberately positioned new construction near or directly incorporated fragments from the monuments of an earlier, more prestigious civilization. Put side by side, these 3 discoveries, El Palmar's inscription rewriting the early history of Maya kingship, the newly uncovered ceremonial complex near Coatepec, revealing a previously undocumented culture in Veracruz, and the Toltec-era structure and burials found near Tula, aren't isolated curiosities. They represent an active, ongoing wave of archaeological fieldwork happening across Mexico right now, in 2026, each investigation independently peer-reviewed, publicly announced, and backed by named research institutions, rather than anonymous online claims. It's worth being clear about what kind of history is actually being rewritten here, because that word gets thrown around loosely online. Nobody is claiming a lost global civilization or a hidden advanced society predating known history. What's actually happening is more precise, and in its own way, more compelling. Researchers are using modern imaging technology that simply didn't exist a generation ago to extract legible information out of stone that field archaeologists have physically walked past for decades without being able to fully read. Stela 46 sat at El Palmar for years before anyone could confirm what was actually carved into its worn surface. The technology to read it properly only became practical and affordable, enough for routine archaeological use within roughly the last several years. That's the real story connecting all 3 of these Mexican discoveries. It isn't about buried secrets being hidden from the public. It's about the limits of what previous generations of researchers were physically capable of detecting, and how quickly those limits are now falling away. Kenichiro Tsukamoto's team didn't stumble onto a hidden chamber. They spent nearly 20 years conducting methodical fieldwork at a single site before new technology finally let them read a stone that had been sitting in plain view the entire time. The version of history being rewritten here is specific and well-defined. It concerns exactly when, and precisely how, Maya rulers first began using calendrical inscriptions to publicly stake their claim to political power, pushing that origin point back by over a century based on physical, dated, peer-reviewed evidence. That century matters more than it might initially seem. Historians studying the emergence of Maya kingship have generally treated the beginning of the Classic period, around 250 CE, as a rough dividing line, a point after which centralized dynastic rule and institutionalized political authority become clearly visible in the archaeological record. Stela 46 sits inside that murkier earlier window, meaning El Palmar's rulers were already using one of the most sophisticated tools of political legitimation available to Maya civilization, decades before most other lowland sites show any comparable evidence of centralized dynastic authority. It had already been developing quietly and locally for at least a generation beforehand, at sites like El Palmar that simply hadn't been recognized as early political centers until this new evidence surfaced. The same principle applies to the other two discoveries, just in different registers. At Coatepec, the revision concerns an entirely undocumented cultural tradition in Veracruz that built distinctive ceremonial architecture unlike anything previously cataloged in that specific region. At Tula, it concerns the way later Mesoamerican societies, centuries after the Toltec capital's political collapse, deliberately built new monuments beside its ruins to visually borrow its legendary authority for themselves. None of that required a hidden chamber sealed away from public view. It required patient decades of fieldwork, updated technology, and researchers willing to keep scanning stones that everyone else had already assumed had nothing left to say. What ties all three sites together is a single, consistent lesson about how archaeology actually progresses. It rarely arrives as a single dramatic revelation. It accumulates, slowly, one carefully documented excavation season at a time, until enough small corrections stack up to genuinely shift the accepted timeline. Stela 46 didn't appear out of nowhere in 2026. It had been sitting at El Palmar since long before any modern researcher ever walked the site, waiting for technology precise enough to finally let its carved surface speak. That, ultimately, is what changes human history. Not secrecy, and not sudden hidden discoveries pulled from some concealed vault, but the steady, unglamorous work of archaeologists returning again and again to places already known, armed with better tools, until stone that has stayed silent for 18 centuries finally gives up what it was carved to say. There's also a broader pattern worth noting across all three of these 2026 discoveries, one that says something about the current state of Mexican archaeology more generally. Each project was carried out or directly overseen by INAH, Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, a government body responsible for both protecting archaeological heritage and actively conducting new excavations across the country. Mexico is estimated to hold tens of thousands of registered archaeological sites, with new ones identified virtually every year, and the steady cadence of major discoveries emerging from Mexico in recent years, of which El Palmar, Coatepec, and Tula represent just the latest examples, is less a series of lucky coincidences and more a direct reflection of sustained, well-organized institutional investment in archaeological fieldwork. That context is worth keeping in mind the next time a headline claims some new discovery in Mexico rewrites human history. Often, as in these three cases, that claim turns out to be entirely accurate, just not in the way a viewer expecting hidden pyramids or lost civilizations might initially assume. The actual rewriting happens in far more precise, far more verifiable ways. A calendar date pushed back by 112 years, a previously uncatalogued architectural style identified in Veracruz, a physical link established between a later structure and Tula's most sacred earlier monument. Each of those revisions is narrow, specific, and fully documented, which is exactly what makes them trustworthy. Real historical revision rarely arrives as a single sweeping revelation. It arrives exactly like this, stone by stone, season by season, scan by careful scan.